welcome everybody to day 4 of the meeting. We made good progress yesterday, so we're fairly well through the leases item, and then we'll move on to natural resources afterwards. But I think actually at this stage I'm going to hand back to João to take us into the 4th issue on leases.
Yes, thank you, Ian, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. So, as Ian said, the last agenda item for this session is agenda item 6.2.4 on the fair value definition. So this issue actually was a specific matter for comment in exposure draft 75 leases. But basically, what happened is that that exposure draft proposed to retain the IPSASB 13/IFRS 16 definition of fair value to be applicable only to that standard. Once again, this was overwhelmingly supported by the constituents. However, we noticed that there is a significant minority of constituents that disagreed with this proposal and would prefer to have the fair value definition as proposed in exposure draft 77 measurement. Basically, for those two reasons that are on the slide. So having two fair value definitions in IPSASB's literature may cause confusion, and also as that definition would be mostly applicable to sale and leaseback transactions, and those transactions in the public sector occur infrequently. So it wouldn't be enough reason, according to those constituents, to provide two different definitions of fair values. So once again, all these issues were considered by the board, so staff and the task force views is that there is that these are already issues that the board considered when developing ED 75, and therefore our recommendation to the board is to proceed with ED 75 proposals and retain the IFRS 16 and IPSASB 13 definition of the fair value, because no new thinking was provided by respondents that led the board to retain the IPSASB 13 definition of fair value. The other reason is that the fair value definition in ED 77 is not yet finalized, so it's still out for consultation. We don't know what would be the outcome of that consultation. So, and also the fair value definition should only be amended if and when as a result of the consequential amendment from IPSASB on measurements. So what I ask the board is whether it agrees with the staff and task force's recommendation. And with this, I'll pass to Ian and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thanks, João. Lynn, anything else you wanted to add to this before we open for discussion? Okay, thanks. So open for comments then in terms of staff's recommendation. Camira.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, João. I agree with the recommendation. I would only suggest to modify one of the bases for conclusion, the BC 45, the numeral C, that it talks about as a reason that it provides relief to preparers by not requiring significant changes to their accounting system for this aspect. So I think that that should not be a reason for, so maybe replace it with the reason that the exposure draft 77 is already still in consultation and this could be changed, but providing relief for preverse should not be a reason for us to retain this this definition. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. So what I'll do is I'll just take comments from members, and I've got 3 hands up at the moment, and then go back to you, João, at that stage. So I've got Lindy, Mark, then David.
Thank you. So I support the recommendation that we leave the definition as is, because it's an alignment project. We've already considered it and there was no new thinking that brought in, but also just to note that in the measurement project, we said that we didn't make any amendments or propose consequential amendments. We said in there that it will be any changes to the leases standard will be part of the lease project. So we've already signaled in ED measurement that it's not part of the measurement project, it's part of leases. And now in these BCs, we're pushing it back. So I think we should just decide that we leave it. You know, if it comes up at a later stage, deal with it, but we're not being consistent in the messaging that we're currently putting out. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Mark?
I generally agree with the recommendation. What I worry a little bit is the question of the ED on measurement. I would agree if it would be a gap between 1 or 2 years between those standards, but if I look at the time plan, I see that while IFRS 16 is due in June 22, the measurement is only 1 IPSASB meeting afterwards, and I guess at that time in June we should already know what kind of amendments could result. So I worry a little bit that the stakeholders might start to analyze the consequence of the old fair value and then just 1 meeting later. So wouldn't it be worse in this case to say, given the small time frame, to issue it together?
Thanks, Mark. So I think there's an emerging point on due process, and Ross, when I've completed the round of comments, I'll perhaps just pass to you in terms of the overall programme perspective. So David and then Scott.
Thank you. I also support the recommendation, but also have concerns about the reference to ED 77. The definition of fair value in ED 77 is the same as that in IFRS 13. The leases project is an alignment project. If the IASB didn't change the definition of fair value in IFRS 16 to reflect that in IFRS 13, I don't see where this argument about ED 77 comes in at all, because at the moment it's suggesting that once we've got responses to ED 77, we might go back and change our definition of fair value, and I don't think that's what we're proposing.
Thanks, David. So go to Scott, and then I'll go to you, Ross, for a sort of overall view on this.
Yeah, thank you, and I agree. I'd send a message to João on this. I'm agreeing with David and Lindy on this. I don't even think, I thought we concluded alignment and we were done. So I'm not sure why we even need to mention ED 77. I think our conclusion is alignment, and I would stop there. Okay, so I think, you know, rounding up what I've heard is support for retaining the IFRS 16 definition of fair value. So as we exposed in ED 75, I think the question then arises as to how do we handle this in the context of, as Mark points out, you know, the plan being that we will finalise ED 77 on measurement, which of course includes the IFRS 13 definition on measurement. And, you know, we've got this in a number of areas in terms of just a number of moving parts, particularly sort of around this standard actually is impacted by a number of others. So I think the question is how, you know, is how we want to handle that, how categoric we want to be at this stage. Do we need to be? You know, yeah, so at that stage, hand over to you, Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think where the board's landing is consistent with what constituents have told us. So it was a majority in support of the proposal in ED 75. So João is doing his due diligence and looking at the comments that were against that and kind of giving a view on how it might fall out. I think we have to wait and see where we get on measurement. And we'll have to make a decision at that time if there is a consequential amendment needed for the new IPSAS on leases or not. But I think we're in a good position where people have agreed with what was proposed. It is in line with what the ISB's done, and this is an alignment project. So I think just getting the comms right and the BCs for the right reasons, and I think members have just helped us out with a little more clarity on those right now, is the right approach. And then when we get to the end of measurement, whenever that is, we'll evaluate any consequential amendments at that time and look at what we need to do. So if the board decides at that time it wants to go back and revisit the lease's fair value definition, we'll look at whether we've got support for that in the comments to measurement or not, and whether we need a minor exposure draft to expose that consequential amendment, or whether constituents have asked strong enough that we can make those changes along with the finalization of the measurement standard. But so that's kind of, I think, where we stand at the moment in a due process perspective. But I think there's full support from what we've heard from constituents on ED 75 to finalize ED 75 based on what we exposed.
Okay, so I think probably the one missing piece of information, I think, is it would be good perhaps to just understand a little more from ISB staff as to exactly what the nature of the discussions was there, because I think amongst our constituents, clearly there are concerns where we have different definitions, for essentially the same context, and the definition we've got of fair value is pretty much the same, I think, as market value in ED 77. So there is some potential confusion, and I think we kind of need to actually understand from the ISB, was this genuinely considered as an issue, or did they just draw stumps at this point in time and decide they weren't going to do anything more with it? So I think, but in finishing off this draft standard, it's probably better to focus more on the alignment, which I think is what members have said, even if we just acknowledge the fact that it is different to the definition in IFRS 13 and that being proposed in ED 77, and probably leave it at that at this stage. Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think that was a perfect lead over and intro to what I was just to kind of mention shortly, because I think you are all aware that the CAG in the discussion of measurement made the recommendation to have one consistent definition when talking about fair value, which is in line with IFRS 13. I do not contradict what Jan Ross just said. I think it's an issue which comes kind of from the IFRS world into our standard setting discussion. So I think it's pretty reasonable what you just said. Probably it's the best going back to the ISB, getting clarity there, and then see what to do in our set of standards and in our definitions.
Thanks, Thomas. I think that does show the tension there. So if we have that as the way forward, we stick with the aligned definition. We revise the drafting in the BCs to focus on alignments, whilst just factually noting the difference with IFRS 13 and the fact that we have an ongoing project. And then that piece of research with ISB staff when we can come back to that when we have a clear direction in terms of ED 77, hopefully by around about this time next year, and then make a decision based on those facts as to whether we make any changes at that stage. Everyone okay with that summary? And I think, obviously, Zhao, there's a bit of finessing then on the drafting that needs to be done to acknowledge that. And I think also just, perhaps making sure that we pick up the, that should do it. That should also make the change then that I think Camilla is quite rightly picking up in terms of the reasoning. Okay, so I think that with that we are through the issues for this meeting, João. Clearly, and it was very helpful, I think, the way João laid out the papers with the relevant basis for conclusions proposed to support the staff recommendations. If there are any drafting changes, obviously please send those through to João. What I wanted to do was really just at a very high level to check in terms of where we are on the drafting. João did very helpfully give us a markup of the draft final standards, which essentially there are very limited changes other than perhaps in the basis for conclusion. So what I wanted to do was just get any general comments perhaps on the main part of the standard, and then just have a look at the basis for conclusions changes, so that essentially the board has reviewed changes to date. João, anything else you'd like to add before we just go through that bit of process?
No, Ian, thanks. So the core text of DD and the BCs, those are the changes. That's all. Thank you. Okay.
So obviously, because we haven't thus far agreed any changes to the core text, the changes that João's made are obviously to just process changes to move us towards references to the final version. Is there anything then in terms of the core standards, i.e. the material up to before the basis for conclusions? Are there any points members want to raise on anything there? Okay. Yes, Todd, go ahead.
I don't know whether you wanted any comments on amendments to other standards at this point.
Is there anything that you think the board should debate at this stage, Todd, or is it something that could be dealt with by staff offline?
It's just when you get into the amendments to other standards, we've got amendments to exposure draft 70, 71, etc. And I think from memory, we put that in because there were going to be a whole lot of exposure drafts out at the same time. But if we're going to finalise this as a standard, I think that material would have to come out. So I just wanted to get that registered, and staff can go away and perhaps think about that.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, I see Ross has got a thumbs up on that. I think in terms of moving forward with this, and this is really the comment about how we handle the various different moving parts that we have, clearly we will need a holistic recommendation from staff in terms of how we approach that. Ross, I don't know whether you want to say anything at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just a quick point to note that there are a couple issues related to the timing of the approval of this standard and revenue that staff are working to address, and we'll bring a paper on that. And the amendments to other IPSAs and the point you raised, Todd, will fall under that. And we're aware of that. So, but thanks for flagging it, and we'll make sure we give a full paper that pulls together all these issues with a strong staff recommendation on what we're going to do and make the appropriate amendments. Obviously, working in together with Lynn on that too as task force chair.
Thanks, Ross. And I think, you know, it's quite an unusual situation we face at the moment. But, you know, if you look at our work programme as it is at the moment, actually, potentially, we're slated to approve 8 final IPSAS by the end of next calendar year. So there's a lot of kind of, you know, how do we make all of this fit together? Type issues that we're going to face. So I think that paper will be very important. Thanks, Ross. Okay, so anything else then on the core text of the standard before we just have a look at the key changes in terms of basis for conclusions? Okay, so João, perhaps you can just direct us to where the main changes come in basis for conclusions, because I want to make sure that the board is happy with the changes that have been made thus far.
Yes, thanks, Ian. So the BCs, as they were in the ED 75, they are pretty much there in this draft IPSAS. So what staff did was to add the consultation and the consultation process and the review of the issues raised by constituents. So if the board could go to page 90 of the exposure draft, that's where staff started to insert those BCs to address the exposure draft 75 leases and the request for information. And so those are still draft BCs, and following from that, then in each issue, staff then inserts a section related to the responses to ED 75. That's the process in terms of the structure, and each section will be adding more BCs as the board decides on each issue. So what I want to receive from the board is whether it agrees with this structure, and also if it has any major concerns on the BCs. But I'm more than happy to receive offline any editorials in terms of adding, removing, or changing any wording, paragraphs, whatever. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, João. So not the end of the story, but would just be helpful to get any concerns from members at this stage. David.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just looking at BC 40, where there's the last, well, it's only the 2 sentences anyway. It says, this is partially explained because some respondents that had initially supported ED 64 proposals for lessor accounting changed their views and now support ED 75 proposals. I just thinking of it from sort of the UK's perspective, when we were looking at doing the responses, I wouldn't say that the UK had, well, certainly CIPFA when we were doing the response, I don't say that we had changed our views, but we recognised the practical issues that the board had discussed and therefore supported ED 75, although actually conceptually we would have preferred something to have gone ahead more in line with something in ED 64. So I think perhaps I haven't got a suggestion of wording, I'm afraid, but I think maybe something needs to be done with that particular phrase to change their views.
I mean, I wonder whether the easiest thing, David, is actually just to delete that sentence, because the first is factually correct, and we could get ourselves into, some nuances and so on, and you can argue backwards and forwards, and I'm not sure that it actually adds anything. So I think, let propose deletion. Mike.
Yeah, so Chair, I went through this in quite a lot of detail when we went through the ED64 process, and what João has written may not reflect what happened from the UK response, but it does reflect what happened in the responses more generally. So, but I think you're right, take it out.
Okay, thanks, Mike, that's helpful. Lindy?
Thank you very much. I was just have a comment on the BCs on the exemption and the low value exemption, and the discussion there is around materiality, but I don't think that is necessarily what the ISB wanted. If you look at AG5, there might be some inconsistencies there, so perhaps you can just engage with staff to relook at the wording there. It's not materiality to the entity, it's actually just an absolute value that the exemption applies to. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. I think that would be helpful. Todd.
Thanks, Ian. And my comment is related to BC 65. I agree with BC 65. I just don't think that that has actually been reflected in the illustrative examples at this stage. So just a note to make sure that the changes are made to the illustrative examples as is mentioned in that basis, the conclusions paragraph.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Okay, so I think we have 3 instructions there related to each of those interventions: deletion of that sentence, dealing with the exemption as per Lindy's comment and that point that Todd's just raised. So as Joao has said, if there are any other drafting comments or other concerns that members come up with, if you could pass those over to Joao so that he can resolve those. So in terms of then perhaps Ross, do you want to talk about the way forward from here? We've obviously got still four issues to address, but perhaps you can just give the board an outline of what the proposed way forward is.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So based on a discussion that has been ongoing between staff, we realized there's just 4 fairly minor issues outstanding from the responses we received on ED 75. And when we look at the timeline and the progress we've been able to make on the core issues that we've brought to the last 2 meetings, we think we have an opportunity here to actually approve Lisa's ED 75 in a quicker manner than what the current work program says. So our plan is to bring those final 4 issues back to the October check-in and have Joao do final papers on those 4 issues so the board members can clear the final approach to deal with those final comments, have another look at the updated ED, and then we are hoping to bring it back for board approval at the December meeting. And as noted, we'll have 2 core papers supporting that approval. One dealing with how we'll deal with the issues that Todd noted in related to amendments to other IPSAs and some references to ED 70 in the core text of the ED with a proposal on how to deal with those issues. And the other issue will be to set out how this relates to the RFI second phase of the project from a due process perspective and how the items that come out of the RFI will impact this standard or other standards, just so the board's clear about how these 2 projects work together. And the reason we're going to need this type of paper going forward on a number of these interrelated projects, as Ian's already alluded to, with a number of new IPSAs coming out in close proximity, there's no realistic way we can approve everything at once. So we're going to have to make decisions on how things are going to outrun as we finish different projects. So Lisa's is our first crack at this, but it's I think it's a good use of board time to try and get leases approved in December, and then we can turn to the RFI in the leases stream, and then we've got measurement coming back and then the related projects to measurement. So I just wanted to share that with board members so they're aware on what we're planning for both the check-in in December related to leases. And to be honest, I think we've done the lion's share of the ED 75 work. These issues coming back are pretty minor points the board's already discussed in approving ED 75, and we just want the board to hear the feedback we've received on a couple of comments so that they're comfortable with the final decision. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. And obviously, in doing that work, staff will be working with Lynn as task force chair in terms of the approach to those. Lynn, anything you wanted to say at this stage before I go to Mike?
No, only to add that doesn't mean we are ignoring the second phase of the project in what's being proposed here. And we sort of alluded to this yesterday in terms of eventual implementation dates and timing of the second phase. So this is a sort of approval in principle, but still is an approval that we're looking for in December. Thanks,
Lynn. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I was just going to make the same point Lynn has, and I think it's appropriate that she should remind us of that. But I also just thought I should, and I've got a bit of a conflict here because I'd love to see this ED or this standard issue before I disappear. But I think the board should just quickly have a look at page 2 of our pack, which is where those 4 issues are summarized or mentioned, and just be comfortable, Ross and Joao, that they are actually minor. I think they are minor. I think they're matters that we discussed at quite length before, but just make sure we've had a look at them before we say, okay, we're going to bring this forward.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I think very much the plan is that the issues should be, you know, the board should have a look at the issues at the October check-in, and then obviously the sort of finalisation process Ross has referred to, you know, would be framed in the context of, you know, that's anything that emerges from that, and then these general interrelationship issues that we need to address. Did you want to add anything to that, Ross, before I go to Lindy?
Yeah, just a minor point. Yeah, Mike, it's a good point. Should we not be able to get through these issues, or one of them proves to be a major issue, we won't bring it for approval in December, obviously. So this is all contingent on the board being comfortable with the papers we draft for the check-in and the ultimate landing of the issues. If we still have things outstanding, we will push for early approval.
Thanks for that assurance, Ross. Lindy.
Thank you. I support the proposal. I just wanted to also check, when we previously discussed and agreed on the service potential versus economic benefits, I think there was still some work that had to be done on the illustrative examples to make sure that the right references were used. And I don't know if that's already been done or if that's something that still needs to be done. Just in looking at that in detail again before the next meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. I mean, my understanding is that work has been done, but and Lynn's nodding. So I think you know, that process on behalf of the board has been gone through. Okay. So I guess you know, really, Joao or Lynn, anything else you need from the board in this session at all?
No, nothing from my end, and thanks to the board.
Okay.
No, nothing, no.
Okay, well, I think thanks on behalf of the board for the way in which you brought the material forward. You know, Lynn, thanks very much for the time I know you've put in on our behalf, particularly referencing back, you know, Lindy's comments and so on. I know you've rinsed through those several times. You know, I think, you know, we're now beginning to evolve a clearer way forward on a number of quite tricky handling issues. So thanks everyone on that. And obviously we will then see those 4 issues back for the October check-in. And then the other pieces of the jigsaw that Ross has referred to. Okay, good. So with that, we're through on leases for this meeting, and we move on to natural resources. So on that, handing over then to Edwin, and of course, Lindy is the task force chair on this one. So Edwin, I think over to you at this stage.
Thanks, Ian. We've sent out a few papers on natural resources, and the way I'm going to cover the topics is to go through Chapter 6 presentation first, and then revisit the other chapters which we had previously presented to the board. Before I get started on that, though, I just wanted to check with Lindy if she had any opening remarks before I go into the papers.
Thanks. No, I don't have any opening remarks, thanks. But thanks to Edwin and staff for taking this project forward in the task force, thanks.
Okay, and just to say, I think this is good that we're starting, if you like, at the other end of the document, because this chapter is obviously the area that is going to be critical to this project, but we haven't had the opportunity as a board to discuss this before. So I think, you know, this is a very important item from our, you know, from the whole project perspective. So Edwin, with that, hand over to you.
Okay, so as I said, the first section we're dealing with is on Chapter 6, which is presentation. And the way we've approached this with the task force is we've first looked at what the conceptual framework talks about in terms of presentation in both the general purpose financial statements and the general purpose financial reports. And at the outset, we agreed that at this point in the project, we should focus on information selection. So just as a bit of background, the way the chapter in the conceptual framework is set out, they talk about a selection of information to be presented and also the location and organization of information to be presented. And right now, the task force has taken a position that at this stage, we're only talking about information selection because it's hard to talk about where we're putting the information or how we're organizing it while first agreeing on what to actually present. So that's the first point that I wanted to run by the board. So I guess before I go into the detail, I just wanted to get confirmation that the board generally agrees with that approach.
Thanks, Edward. And I think, probably what we'll do is we'll use this approach on each of the chapters to just open up for overall comments or comments on the overall approach that's been taken and just get those high level comments out from members first. So anybody, any comments at this stage? I saw a thumbs up from Ajith. Other thoughts, comments? No, I think people are supportive of the overall approach you've taken, Edwin. So take us on to the next stage.
Okay, so the next stage is we looked at the actual details of what the conceptual framework talks about in terms of what we should be presenting. So the framework talks about presenting financial information that is necessarily to understand the financial statements and also provides context for the financial statements. And based on that, we have drafted required disclosures or proposed disclosures in items A to E of the preliminary review 10, which is at the back of the chapter. And I've also included the preliminary review in the paper itself, if the board wants to have a look. Okay. So in addition to that, the framework also talks about presentation of non-financial information. And those are items that are not recognized, but are important to understanding the entity's finances and their ability to deliver services, and also information to explain underlying trends. So based on that piece of the framework, we came up with proposals for disclosure items F to H in the preliminary review. Okay. And in addition to the framework, we've also looked at existing RPGs. So those are recommended practice guidelines that are not required, but they're recommended for the presentation of GPFRs. And based on those, we came up with proposals I to K in the preliminary review, which deals with information on long-term fiscal sustainability as it relates to natural resources, proposals on the discussion of financial statement discussion and analysis to explain the entity's financial position, financial performance, and cash flows as they relate to natural resources, and also the principal risk and uncertainties faced by the entity as they relate to natural resources. And the last proposed disclosure based on the RPGs was we also said that there should be discussion about program objectives and performance indicators for those programs that are related to natural resources. So those proposals are in items L to K, or sorry, I to K in the preliminary review. The last piece that we've looked at was, in addition to this, we looked at private sector practices to see if there's anything else that private sector companies in the extractive space discloses. And based on our research, the only additional disclosure is that there are regulatory requirements to talk about the feasibility of an extraction or development project. So that has also been added as a proposed disclosure item, and that is in item L of the preliminary review. So based on this, I guess the best approach is to walk through each item in the PV and get the board's views. But before I hand it over to the board, I just wanted to bring up that I did receive a number of, I guess, wording comments, and also a comment about the last point on the feasibility, because now that I think about it, that is really more related to the actual extraction project than the underlying natural resources. So I'll go back to the task force and have a rethink on whether that's really a natural resource related disclosure or whether it's more an impairment disclosure related to the project itself. So I'll hand it over to the board for discussion now.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So I think if we can take general comments on the approach that's been taken, and the approach to the formulation of the PVs, then what I'd like to do is actually just walk us through a page by page of the content of the chapter, and then we'll come to the wording of the PVs at the end of that process. So if I can take general comments on the approach that's been taken, and those sort of introductory scene setting remarks in terms of the way in which the PVs have been approached. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, everyone. So I support the approach that's been taken. My only question was, if you look at Part E of the PV, is this information going to be auditable? I haven't got a view at the moment, but I just want to make sure we don't put things in financial statements that auditors are not going to be able to opine on, or is the information going to be available? That's my main concern.
Thanks, Mike. So I'll take comments from the other auditors around the table, clearly, but I'll take comments from members and then go back to you, Edwin. So I've got Todd, then Lynn, then Camira.
I'm not wearing my auditor hat and making these comments. For the record. I think that it's very helpful to set out this preliminary view. One thing that I think we need to make clear in setting out this is, I think what we are talking about here is in the context of natural resources that meet the definition of an asset. And I think that comes through when I look at some of the other present values, which basically say if you haven't got an asset, then you probably wouldn't have disclosure. So it would be helpful for that to be made quite clear, I think, in this in this preliminary view, that it is about natural resources where you have an asset, that you're thinking about these sorts of things.
Thanks, Todd. Lynn, then Camira, and then Thomas.
So I wasn't as clear as Todd actually about whether or not you were talking about natural resources where you might have an asset but haven't recognized it because you can't measure it. So I think there is a clarity needed about when you're talking about those that are recognized, when you're talking about those that meet the that could be recognized but you can't measure. And I think we ought to be clearer on where we're talking about disclosure, because I think when I was looking, for example, at the non-financial information, I wasn't clear in my own mind whether or not we expected all of this to be disclosed in the general purpose financial statements, and we should be clear if that is what we mean, so that we can get views on that basis and not have people who might think, oh, actually you're talking about a broader disclosure, therefore, for example, I don't need to worry about auditability as a for example. So I think we should be clear if we mean disclosure in the general purpose financial statements or not.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's helpful, and you know, situating this in the context of you know, the broader sustainability reporting debate. Obviously, that what is in the general purpose financial report space as opposed to general purpose financial statements becomes important, and that also has an interrelationship with assurance standards and so on. So I think that's entirely right, that we need to be you know, making proposals, but in that with that clarity about where are we you know, where are we proposing this information should be provided. So I go to Camira and then to Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. In generally, I support the approach taken by the staff. I only have some concerns in the preliminary view in number D when we are referring to sale of subsoil resources, because according to the definition of natural resources, we are taking out the human intervention. So if there's no human intervention, how is it possible that the reporting entity will be able to sell the natural resources? So that could be a bit confusing or inconsistent. And also, I like in general the the disclosures in relation to the not recognized natural resources, because are consistent with what we propose in ED 78 for the non-recognized heritage assets. So I really like that. Only the third point is that it's like additional. That was not very understandable. Just like to but explain that a bit better. So thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Camira. Thomas, I'll go to you, Mike, after that.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. The CAG discussed the issue of recognition and disclosure in the June meeting. I think in general, I think the CAG was supportive to recognize resources which fulfill the recognition criteria and to provide disclosures on that. And that in terms of the PV would be probably A to C. Not sure about D, because sale could also be referring to resources which were not recognized, but okay, that's somewhere in between. There were more concerns of information overload for these resources which fit in the description but not fulfill the recognition criteria. I think this would be number E. I think probably I have the same, in that regard, the same concerns as Camira regarding the third one. Not so sure what that could provide in terms of useful information. The second concern the CAG discussed was the kind of disclosing resources in terms of which were not recognized and providing this non-financial information. And here that these types of information could provide an incentive or a motivation for politicians to kind of exploit these resources in the future. Not so sure. I think in terms of the physical quantities, I think it might be interesting from one perspective, but on the other side, the CAG was warning that this could create unhealthy motivations for politicians. So just to add that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. And clearly that cuts a number of ways in terms of, accountability and, wanting to ensure appropriate usage, etc. So there's a number of different motivations in that area. Mike, and then Renee and Scott.
Thanks, Chair, for letting me come back in again. It just as I've been reading again through the PV, it just occurred to me, Edwin, is the item, for example, in F to H, which is the non-financial information, is that intended as being in the financial statements or in some other document? I mean, it's clear to me that I onwards is going to be in an RPG. I just wanted to be clear about what you're proposing should be in the financial statements.
Okay, so I'm going to take comments from Renee and then Scott, and then Edwin, I'll go back to you at that stage. Renee, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I am comfortable with the approach too, but in hearing Todd and Mike and Lynn, I realized that I had understood this to be a very broad approach, where at this early stage of the project, we would want to seek input on information. And I think the paper was clear at the beginning that we're not worrying about location, financial statements or outside financial statements. And I would want us to be careful to maximize the benefit of the input that we get at this very early stage, that we try not to get bogged down too much into what will be in the financial statements or not. Maybe if we have preliminary reviews, we could, but I would want whatever we bring to constituents to be a broader question of what would you expect information to be in either places, inside or outside financial statements. So I was comfortable. That's what I understood from the discussion paper. And I think, Todd, your point was that you wanted to clarify that we were seeking input on information that would end up in the financial statements, but maybe not. Maybe I misunderstood your point. But personally, I would want us to start broad, and then we deal with the universe of information, and in the next stage of the project, then we will talk about selection. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I think we're walking a tightrope here, and I think, as you say, what we don't want to do is unnecessarily constrain. But I think equally the thing that you know, I would take from the discussion so far is we've not overtly raised that issue about what would conventionally sit in general purpose financial statements as opposed to general purpose financial reports. And clearly our RPGs actually, as they stand at the moment, relate to GPFR material that's not in the GPFS. So I think we've got to walk that tightrope, if you like, and perhaps there's some language that needs to go in, which is indicative of about, in a sense, the PVs are framed within the existing sort of typography and landscape, but actually there might be ambitions, and some of this also relates into auditability and so on. So I think we're going to need to be careful, probably, that we frame in the context of existing approaches and so on, but mindful of the fact that this is a very fluid landscape, and certainly, you know, for example, colleagues in IPSASB will be looking at you know, the audit implications of sustainability reporting information potentially being in general purpose financial reports. What does that mean? So we need to get that kind of sort of sense of fluidity into it, but at the same time trying to make some recommendations so that our stakeholders can flow back. So I think you raised some very good points there in terms of how we couch it, how we approach it. Scott, then Mike, and I'll go back to Edwin at that stage.
Yeah, I raised my hand. Renee and I raised our hand about the same time. Thank you for acknowledging me. Is that I want to make the same point. We won't get any broader than it is here in the consultative paper. So I encourage us to push the boundaries because normally they won't come broader. And I think we can tease out some of these issues about location with the SMCs and that particular item. Yeah, C is probably hard, and I can give you experience with FASAB when we put a requirement on acreage. It seemed very easy on a piece of paper, but this is not the type of information people probably maintain. And so we got a lot of feedback on what would be the logistics to be able to put something like this together. So I think, again, I'm just supporting Renee's comment that I think we ought to go broad and push the envelope, because that way you will actually get information back. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Mike, final comment, and then I'm going back to Edwin at that point.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So having raised the issue about location, I'm happy to support Renee and Scott. I think this, I keep reminding myself this is a CP, not an ED. So that's the point at which we want to get information back from our constituents. Thanks.
I mean, I think we're going to have to walk a tightrope here, because there are a lot of pressures for more and more and more disclosures, and what we hear from our stakeholders all the time is you're asking for too much, it's too detailed, and I think that's going to be part of the challenge that we face. So I do think we've got to be very careful about how we couch this argument, and I think, you know, for example, Scott, you raised the point there about SMCs. I think we need to think quite carefully about how we sort of balance this. And I think there is an instruction here that when we work this up in the context of that, where would conventionally the information sit, GPFS, GPFRs or not? And I think there is a not, because this is financial statements rather than everything. That there is a discussion with colleagues in the IPSASB on the audit implications of this. Now, we're not writing a paper for the audit profession, but we did have this issue that came up when we were doing the RPG, that we did need to have a discussion with colleagues on the audit side, you know, in framing our recommendations. So Edwin, at that point, you've had a lot of input from members. I'm going to go back to you at this stage.
Thanks, Ian. So I would say that the task force and the staff's view is aligned with what Renee and Scott said. So we purposely didn't set out what's in the FS versus the financial reports because we wanted to get the entire universe of information and then decide after that where to put things in. And of course, like we're going to have to think about the audit implications. And so at this point, I mean, I do have my own views on where things should go, but I think if I were to put those in, that would really limit the feedback we would get from constituents. So that's why we held off doing that. Yeah.
So perhaps in terms of the way forward, I don't think we can actually honestly write this section without actually referring to you know, conventionally where information would be located. And I think we can couch it in the context of the, if you like, where things rest at the moment. And, you know, obviously refer to the fact that you know, there are developments, but there are also audit implications around location of information. Probably by introducing that shouldn't then constrain what we're putting in the PVs, but I think at least it raises it as a context. And that's probably the tightrope that we walk at this stage, and mindful as well of the fact that we are at CP stage rather than standard stage, as Mike pointed out. So I think if people are content with that as a way forward, you know, and we might ask as well, you know, specific matters for comment, I think we might also think about, is that a way of actually getting into additional comments in that area? So perhaps we can leave that with you, Edwin, to just think about that. But I think we do need some material that acknowledges that issue. This isn't just a totally greenfield place. There is, you know, there's existing guidance and precedents and so on. Okay, everybody okay with that as a way forward? So I think that's been a very good opening discussion. What I'm going to propose then is we literally just walk through page by page, because obviously we are going to have to focus back on the PVs, but I do want to pick up general comments that people, or matters of issue that people have on the drafting at this stage. Clearly details of drafting, if you can pass those to Edwin. But I wonder if at this stage I could take comments on paras 6.1 through 6.6. Okay, so if we move on to paras 6.7 through to 6.10. Yeah, David, and then Todd.
Thank you, Ian. It's in 6.10a, where we're referring to the measurement basis, including, if applicable, the valuation date method to use to determine the fair value. I don't think we should be referring to fair value there. I think it should really just be to the method used, the valuation method used, because it might not be fair value.
Thanks, David. Todd?
Thanks, Ian. I'm on 6.10 as well, but part B, and I'm struggling a bit with the concept of depreciating natural resources. I can't think of a situation where you would. I'd be interested if there are some examples where you would actually depreciate a natural resource. If there are examples, then fine to leave it in there, but it could help to have the example for constituents. If no one can think of an example of depreciating them, then I don't think we should have it in this section.
Thanks, Todd. Edwin, back on that one.
Yeah, I think a better word would be depletion. But then I was really trying to think of like extraction or removal of the resource more so than depreciation. So I'll go back to the task force and rework that.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So we have one instruction there. Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Actually, that is also my concern. What are the instances on how natural resources could be impaired or depreciated? But I think when it comes to natural resources, depletion might be applicable. And the other question is, what would be the method of, well, right now we're using depreciation, but what would be the method that is appropriate for each type of natural resource? And is the concept of residual value also applicable to natural resources? And if yes, how is it determined? Then with respect to impairment, assessment of impairment, is it required that the assessor be an expert, and whether it will also be a requirement for an entity to assess at each reporting period whether there are indications of impairment, just like what we do in the case of PP&E. So I think these are is recovery of impairment loss also applicable in natural resources? So these are the things that I think should be clarified in the CP to guide our respondents. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I mean, I think in taking this forward, Edwin, we need to be very clear about this, you know, would relate to when you have a natural resource that is recognized, and therefore you know, that's probably the lens that we need to be very careful to look through, because where we are getting to in a lot of cases is there would not be actual recognition. So you know, I think we just need to think that one through very carefully and relate it back into that. And there is, I think, and we'll perhaps come to this later, there is a general issue in terms of the tie back between this section and the individual areas where we've looked at subsoil, water, and so on. So if you can think that through in that context, I think that will probably help then to address whether we need to look at specifically at depletion and so on, because I think that probably moves us the other side of the divide into items that have been subject to human intervention, in which case generally in another standard. So if you can look at it in that context, that would be helpful and locate us in that way. Be very careful about locating us in that. Mike.
Yeah, I was going to support what you say, Chair. I mean, to me, I take Lynn's point, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't worked out whether we're going to recognise and measure and put it on the balance sheet. So we're getting ahead of, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're talking about then we're going to impair something. But whatever you decide to do, Edwin, just fix the PV, because the PV also talks about depreciation in paragraph B. So make sure we just get the cross-checking right.
Thanks, Mike. So I've got Renee and then Adrienne.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to support David's comment in 610A to broaden the reference to the measurement basis broader than fair value. There's cost of fulfillment that comes to mind, current operational value. So if we could just make it broader at this early stage. Also, just backtracking in the introductory text of 610, I have to admit, I had to read that paragraph a few times to then conclude that I think you're talking about information displayed in the financial statements. Well, and it seems that in 6, 8, and 9, you are presenting information that you would expect to see in the notes. And then in 10, I think you're also building on additional information that you would see in the notes. So I don't know if that's the best way to do it. And maybe you had the reason to do it in a two-step approach, but I just leave my reflection with you on whether this is the best way. And in 6.10, can we think about maybe adding a new element in there? And it's a reference to the environmental and regulatory requirements, and potential targets or potential limits that are imposed on an entity in relation to some of the natural resources that they may control or they may have influence on. So the whole idea of compliance there. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Renee. I think that's quite an interesting area, actually, and I think we need to think that through, because obviously it will have an impact, but not necessarily everything in the regulatory space would have an impact. So that's the kind of lens that we need to look through in looking at that. You know, and that might also be that you're never going to be able to exploit it, etc. So there's a number of different facets to that. Adrienne.
So with respect to 610B on depreciation, I found that interesting and not constraining, because it says if applicable, and the introduction make it very clear that it mightn't be applicable. But I found it very helpful to bring in the concept that depreciation might become important, and it's. I would need to go back and look, but I think it's different than depletion, because depletion sounds as if it relates more to quantity, whereas depreciation might address issues of quality as well. And I think these could become relevant. I'm thinking of things like the rainforest capacity to act as a carbon sink, which could be eroded if, for example, if the forest got drier or something like that. So I would be reluctant for us to eliminate this idea that in the future, if applicable, we might want to measure depreciation, which wouldn't be the same as depletion. Now, if Edwin comes back and says, no, depreciation is always the same as depletion, I stand corrected. But otherwise, I'd make a plea for us to leave this in, because I think it's harmless. It doesn't constrain anyone. It just opens the possibility. Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, let's try and be clear about the frame that we're taking here, because the issues are very different if you are, you know, exploiting a resource, i.e. we're in human intervention territory, compared to this is a resource which is in its natural state. In most cases, based on where we're getting to, it will not be recognised, at least there won't be a financial value attributed to it. And, you know, so I think we just need to frame it in that way. I'm not saying that the issues aren't relevant generally, but I think we have to work out what's relevant in terms of what we're proposing either to recognise or disclose in the financial statements. So I think in revising the drafting to 610, and clearly there are a number of issues here. I think, you know, the question is this all one paragraph, or are there a couple of different paragraphs here? Depending on what we're talking about, whether it's something that's recognised, something that's not recognised, something that's in GPFS, something that's in GPFR. So there's quite a few different things that need thinking through on this one. And I think that's the general instruction rather than taking a position on anything at the moment. Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. I think the paragraph 6.10a I think it's okay, not necessary to be broader, because we are talk about the natural resource displayed in statements. And according to the previous chapter, only subsoil resources and some living resource related to with financial capacity may meet the criteria for recognition. Because this, I think, in fact, in accordance with the discussion in previous chapter, historic cost and operational value, it's not possible to apply. I think it's you need to connect with previous chapter. And in the depreciation is in the same context, or the natural resource that can be recognized because meet the criterion. And in this chapter, the natural resource that meet the criteria is related to financial capacity. I'm not.
No,
in my view, it's not. In my view, I think it's necessary to clarify, but not change.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just perhaps if we could, off the back of Patricia's comment, just air one issue, which I think is present in the document at the moment. Edwin, we've got references in the other chapters to presentation, and I guess the question is, could we put all the information, all the discussion on presentation in this chapter, or do we have to have some earlier, which is then problematic, I think, in terms of the structure of the document. So I just sort of wanted to air that at some stage, and this may be not a bad place to do it. If you could just, you know, give us a view on whether you've been deliberate on that, or whether you think, you know, how you think we might go forward with that point.
I think in the other chapters, I was thinking we should only have really just a lead-in to say we're dealing with presentation in chapter 6. I think that will be a lot cleaner, and also it'll present a lot less risk in terms of us putting contradictory information in the document. So I can definitely go back and revise the earlier chapters to move everything into chapter 6. Yeah.
Thanks, and I think that would then go to Patricia's point in terms of, then you can couch it in terms of where a resource is being, a natural resource is being recognised then, and then you start to get into the issues that we've actually been talking about here, but that clarity might help. Lindy.
Thank you, and I agree with that, and I was also wondering that maybe in the individual chapters we could, if possible, come up with kind of a high-level presentation or disclosure objective, because that would also then help with the detail in the later chapter. Kind of just have a concept there that then could be expanded in the chapter 6. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Edwin, I'm just wondering, in taking that forward, there might be something in the ISB's work on presentation where they're looking at presentation objectives. I don't know, and perhaps that's something we should leave with you, that we use that to set, as Lindy says, set objectives for each area, which would flow naturally, presumably, from the way in which it's been discussed, but then the actual mechanics covered in 6. Obviously, I think there's an instruction there, but just any reaction from you on that?
No, I think that's a good idea. So I can definitely look into that and then work with the task force to put everything into chapter 6. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So thanks for that. Sorry, I knew we needed to have that discussion at some stage. So that's probably about the best place. So if I can then take comments on 611 through 616. Okay, 617 through to 621. And then we've got the last couple of paragraphs, 622 and 623. Okay, and then I think that takes us into the preliminary views, the preliminary review 10. Now we've already had a number of comments going through, so I might just take comments on parts A to E on the financial information. Okay, parts F, G, and H, non-financial information. And then, Renee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was debating whether I'm making an editorial suggestion or not, so I was probably going to, I could have written to Edwin on the side, but between B and A and B, there seems to be repetition, or is it B? I'm sorry, B and C. There seems to be repetition when we make reference to accumulated depreciation and impairment loss a couple of times. So just put a placeholder there to look at those two and how they should complement each other, not duplicate each other.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think item D of financial information can also be placed in non-financial information portion. Since information regarding subsoil resources, water living resources, or the right to exploit or access these resources will require both qualitative and quantitative disclosure. And some information on this may require narrative description, which will fall under non-financial information. I also suggest that perhaps you can specify the data required to be disclosed in the discussion of the feasibility of an extraction project in the proposed disclosure in letter L. Up to what extent of the feasibility shall be provided in the discussion. I think this will also guide our stakeholders, especially those rich in natural resources, to effectively and efficiently prepare their GPFS. Thank you, Chair.
Associate Edwin?
Yeah, no, I agree. I can have a look to see if some of that information can be also in non-financial, and I'll think about more details on the feasibility disclosure. As I've mentioned before, I think the more I think about it, the more it seems like that's really related to the development and extraction project. So it might really just be a signpost to say, consider talking about this when you think about disclosures for your recognized intangibles or something like that, rather than a disclosure on natural resources. So, but I'll have a think about that.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Edwin. I think that's helpful. Tricky balance to maintain, I think. Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just a question for clarification regarding non-financial information, number F. As much as I understand, this information is kind of referring to both recognized and not recognized or non-recognized natural resources. In the opposite G, narrative description is only referring to A, which means only to the recognized natural resources. first of all, I think we need to clarify whether F is really kind of focusing on both, and then we need to think about whether it's confusing that on one side you are asking for information of both recognized and not recognized, and in G then you ask for narrative only for the recognized. I think it's a little bit confusing for readers.
Thanks, Thomas. Edwin.
Yeah, so the intention was for F to be both recognized and unrecognized, and I thank you for pointing out that that's actually a typo. G should be referring to F, not A.
Okay, so I think there may be just a kind of question about how we get that signposting right, you know, and it may be that actually we have to have kind of something which is all in the context of recognized items, and then, you know, so just to get that clarity.
Yep.
It is tricky, there's a lot here. Okay, then any comments on I through K on information prepared in accordance with RPGs 1 through 3? Okay, and I think you've already said you're going to pick up L, Edwin. Okay, Patricia.
One question. In fact, I realized now, I think it's necessary to analyze what disclosure will be mandatory or not mandatory. I think it's necessary to think about this too, because for us it is that was recognized the kind of disclosure is or not mandatory, because every possibility here is in the same hierarchy. That's only my.
So I think that, you know, if we set this in the context of where information, the requirements at the moment essentially are IPSAS would be mandatory, that they are requirements and they relate to general purpose financial statements at the moment. RPGs 1 through 3 are recommended, they are non-mandatory, and as they stand at the moment, they relate to GPFR material outside the GPFS. So I think we need to point that out. They're probably then, and this goes to the sort of point that Scott was raising, if we then raise a sort of specific matter for comment on whether people would anticipate changes or would see changes necessary, that may well be the way that we bridge this, because it certainly is a valid point, and I think we will see changes going forwards on that area. So if we can, Edwin, if you can try that out and see how that looks next time round. Lynn.
Yeah, just to follow on from that point, because at the moment the paper is inconsistent throughout. Sometimes it says permit, sometimes it's, and then the PV says should. So I think we need to be really clear and do a consistency check throughout on that.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's a perfectly reasonable point. And I think, again, we have to link that into, if we're talking about recognition or, you know, disclosure requirements in general purpose financial statements, that would be an IPSAS style requirement, as opposed to RPG style disclosures, which would be in GPFR and currently would be non-mandatory. But you're right, we need to get that syntax right. Mike.
Thanks, Ian. I'm very happy with the way you've responded, but I just wanted to make sure I understood Patricia's question. And I wasn't sure Patricia was saying, is it mandatory dependent on whether it's a financial statement or a financial report? It was more, Patricia, clarify for me, were you saying if an item is recognized, then the item requires disclosure of some sort, but if it's not recognized, it may not? When I think if it's going to be recognized or not recognized in the general purpose financial statement context, then there's some disclosure that needs to be made.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. I think some kinds of information the constituent it's expected by constituents that be mandatory. For example, the basis, the measurement basis, for example, or the change. I think it's expected be to be mandatory. But other, it's in the IPSAS context is not mandatory like RPGs. Another, I think we can ask if if have to be mandatory or not. For example, physical quantities.
So that's why I said I think we make our recommendations based on the existing typology, and then we can ask that in a specific matter for comment, you know, because that would get us into exactly the point that Patricia is raising there. So I think we need to see the drafting back on that next time round to make sure that that conveys that. Lindy, final comment, and then I'm going to break.
Thanks, and it is just perhaps something that we need to develop is a matrix, because I think it does depend on whether you have an element or not, whether it's in the financials or not. So perhaps we can build like a matrix and just use that to indicate how we've developed these and where it's put in, because I think there is quite a bit around, you know, if it's not even an element, it might not even go in the GPFSs, but it's something we've considered. But I think it might be useful for us to build a table where we sort things through and then point to what the PV or the requirements might be. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. And again, I think that sort of additional piece of drafting would help on that. Thomas, I really want to break us at this point. I think we've had enough discussion. You know, I think we've given Edwin plenty to think about. I think that table suggestion may well be something that might help visually to locate this. You know, but I think this is going to be tricky, and in getting the drafting in there, I think one of the things we all need to bear in mind is this is a consultation paper. We're not writing a standard at this stage, so it's really to give our constituents the information that we've considered, try and give some indications through preliminary views as to what our expectations are, but also to raise discussion in the right areas. Good. Okay. Well, I think that was exactly the discussion that I felt as a board we needed to have. It is tricky. So those sort of techniques like Lindy has suggested and the framing, I think, are going to be really important. But generally, I think this was a good first draft of the chapter. So thanks to you, Edwin, and also for the input of the task force. So with that, I'm going to take a break now. We will return at 22. So David, if you can keep track on that. So by my watch, we have 13 minutes on that. Okay, thank you.
1 minute.
Great. Okay, we'll just give people just another minute or so to come back. Okay, so having had a good discussion on the presentation chapter, we move from one tricky area to another tricky area onto living resources. So Edwin, back to you.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to talk broadly over what is in the paper. And then I think the intention is to have a detailed read of the chapter after the presentation. So first I'll go through the key changes, which are in 5.2.2. The first change we made to living resource was to respond to a board instruction from June. So if you recall, we were asked to clarify the boundary between what is a natural resource, what has been subjected to human intervention, but not yet in the scope of an existing IPSAS, and what is items that are within the scope of an existing IPSAS. So it's almost like 3 buckets, if you will. So we attempted to do that in living resources because that's where the issue is most relevant. And the discussion of that starts in paragraph 5.6. And I included a flow chart in there as instructed by the board to show what the outcome is for each of the possibilities. So, and we've also introduced a term biological item, which are living resources that have been subjected to human intervention, but do not or are not recognized using an existing IPSAS. So since we've posted the paper, I have received a number of comments on the flowchart and also on this section. And the biggest concern what we've heard was that it seems to be that we're trying to shoehorn this biological item concept into the CP without really discussing where it's coming from and all that. And I guess I just wanted to clarify that was not the original intention. So we wanted to come up with a term that's really a generic term that could be recognized or unrecognized based on whether the biological item meets the asset definition and whether it's measurable. So I'll be going back to the task force with a revised flowchart and a revised section and bring that back to the board at the next meeting. And I guess where we came up with the term biological item is we were trying to mirror or follow what we did in heritage, where, you know, in the ED, we talk about heritage assets, which are recognized, but then there are also unrecognized heritage items. So that's where we got the term from. So I'll make sure I clarify that in the next turn of the CP. The other concern I got was the flowchart doesn't really seem to distinguish between human intervention and control. And I'll definitely be making sure that that is clear in the next version of the flowchart to separate that, those two concepts. And I'm not going to go into detail about that because as you'll see on the slide, we did actually add in an entirely separate section on those two concepts and how they're distinct. So I guess I'll pause here to see if the board has any reactions to this section and the flow chart as it stands right now.
Thanks, Edwin, for that introduction and those comments in terms of, the comments already received from members and your thinking on those. Open up for other comments from members at this stage on what you presented so far. Yeah, Mark.
Yes, I have the question on the definition of human intervention. It's said that human intervention requires a change on quantity or quality of the resource. So does that mean, because we have discussed several boundary issues, such like, let's say, an animal has been introduced in the continent by human intervention, or a forest has been cultivated but then put into a protected area. So this means historically there might have been a human intervention. However, the existing living resources today, they are roaming freely or moving freely, and their quantity and quality is not affected by mankind. Even if they were, for example, inserted a chip to be able to count them, I would then argue they are not affected by quantity and quality. So is this what I think this would potentially solve this boundary, because it would then make clear there could actually be a human intervention, but it has no effect on quantity and quality. Is this the intention? I right in this conclusion?
Thanks, Mark. Back to you, Edwin.
So we haven't explicitly addressed this in the CP, but I think the intention is it's really human intervention that is actively ongoing that would essentially remove something from its natural state. So in your example where we're just putting in a chip, I think you're correct in that that would not be considered human intervention, because after you put the chip in, you're releasing the animals into the wild and they're doing whatever they would have naturally done anyway. So yeah, I think we'll need to clarify that in the CP for sure.
Thanks, Edwin. So I've got Lynn and then Renee.
So as Edwin knows, I'm still struggling with this sort of overlap on human intervention and the way it sort of works its way through the whole CP, where in the description of a natural resource, we're almost then saying if there's human intervention, it's not a natural resource. And then we use human intervention as an indicator of control. I think we're just inconsistent on this. And I think if board members like myself and others are finding it confusing, I'm not sure that we're getting our message over clearly enough for our constituents to understand. And so we sort of keep coming back to this discussion on it. And I think we need to address it in a better way than it's currently addressed, because we refer to it twice. We're not consistent in the diagram after 535. We've got these overlapping circles, and yet we're doing a principles-based piece of work, and then you've got this overlap. I find it confusing and not helpful, and in terms of what's in and what's out. And so I get confused about whether or not I'm out of scope because I've had human intervention, and then I get confused about, okay, but I've got to do some human intervention as an indicator of control. And I know what staff are trying to do on this, which is to sort of use it as a delineation in the what's in and out of scope piece. But for me, it's just still confusing. And I think we need to be much crisper on this. You could, and I know Renee's going to speak next, you could potentially not talk about human intervention when you talk about it still in its natural state and only talk about human intervention on control. That could be one way of doing it. Or you could talk about the purpose of human intervention. If it's a preservation activity or monitoring activity, then maybe that doesn't count and it's still in scope. But at the moment, I just think it's too blurred and very confusing.
So, Lynn, before I ask Edwin to respond, we have had about 2 or 3 discussions in the board about the description, and I think human intervention is a key leg of that. So I don't think we should re-debate that at this stage. I think you're quite right that there needs to be a differentiation between human intervention and control. And I think that's probably the instruction to staff, that actually there needs to be a clear separation between those in the drafting. You know, and I think there is a question, which is really where Mark's question came in, about what that wording in paragraph 18 actually means, which modifies the quantity and or quality of a natural resource. So I think at this stage, we should not go back and reopen the inclusion of this. I think we need to think about the communication and to address those concerns that that you've expressed there in terms of how this plays through, and clearly, particularly in living resources, there are a number of issues in that area. So I think if we can have that parameter in terms of further interventions, that would be helpful. Okay, so with that, to Renee.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering, not going back to changing our decision on the general description, I take your point. I understand, you know, the project management concerns that it creates. Maybe what we need is an SMC at that stage, asking constituents maybe whether human intervention, it comes into play when we're defining what a natural resource is. And maybe we'll deal with their feedback, and maybe we'll get an opportunity to readjust that at some point, depending on their feedback. The reflection I had over the past few days, going back to the general description, was to check it against some of the material offered in the appendix, the research done, what other standard setters have done, and it's interesting that in those other sources of information, they don't use human intervention to generally describe a natural resource. But anyway, I will leave it at that. The comment also I wanted to add is, I think my conversation with staff have been very helpful earlier this week to talk about human intervention and where it comes in the logic and in the flow chart. And I think it comes in before control. And there are I think we all recognize so far, and with the discussion this morning, that there are different degrees of human intervention, different types of human intervention. So I think if we start with natural resource at the very top, and then what makes it a biological item, now I understand, would be any type of human intervention. Right now, the way the paper is written is that you get to biological item only in other human intervention, and we discussed that with Edwin. If we just start with any type of human intervention, and we have a good, clear conversation on the fact that there's different degree, different nature, and then depending on that nature, some human intervention become a factor of control. It is an indicator of control. Then you use human intervention in its nature to then go to the assessment of, do I have an asset and do I control the asset? And if I don't get to the asset stage, then I'm left up in the biological item area, and then we will deal with what we do with those biological items in terms of presentation and of information later on. That logic starting to make more sense to me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. So, you know, just to clarify, in the drafting, the way I think staff have have tried to do this is that human intervention then moves you out of a natural resource into something else, and the something else will generally be covered by another standard. So Edwin, can I just check that that's my understanding is correct on that?
Yes, and so where I was thinking is exactly as Renee has just described. Like I think we just have to make sure the logic hangs together, and in some cases human intervention can be an indicator of control, but then really the key use of human intervention is really deciding whether it's still a natural resource or something else. I think that's what we have to clarify.
Because you would be controlling something else, not a natural resource, if you've got human intervention. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the point that comes out of this is we have to be very clear about what the logic flow is. And there may be something which is actually, you know, around a diagram or something like that right up front in section 2, chapter 2 at the moment, which says, you know, basically this chapter considers and actually really clearly signposts that for people, and then make sure that that structure, having set it up in chapter 2, is then followed clearly through in terms of thinking, subsoil, water, natural resources. So I think, you know, there clearly, because members are expressing concerns about the thinking and the logic flow, we do need to make sure that we've got that signposting absolutely clear and consistent in terms of thinking. Okay, so go to Mari and then back to Lynn.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to back to the Lynn's concern. I have the same concern with Lynn's, and so the human intervention, the definition of the human intervention, it's so important. And so, in broader sense, human intervention, the preservation and conservation activities are included in the human intervention. So what is the asset to be recognized in that perspective? From that perspective, the important thing is it has financial capacity, or it contributes to the operational capacity, and so it's the very critical issue for me. So please explain about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mari. So can we just be absolutely clear in the thinking here? Basically, we use the dividing line of human intervention or not, or where there hasn't been human intervention. Essentially, if there hasn't been human intervention, then you will be in that, you will have a natural resource. If there has been human intervention, then that resource is no longer a natural resource. And the whole thrust of the remaining chapters is then it is either covered already or needs to be covered in updated or new guidance. But that's for all resources that have been, where there is human intervention. Then what we have is the question about what you do with something that there has been no human intervention. And that's the, if I understand it, that's the logic flow. And Edwin, if you can just confirm it. Clearly, I think, as Mari has said, we do need to pay some attention based on the drafting in the chapters, then to actually, do we need to refine that wording in paragraph 18 to get the messages over on human intervention, because there is some uncertainty that members have expressed to me about the interplay between what is human intervention and what is not, around conservation, for example, as Mari says. So Edwin, can you just confirm my understanding is correct on that?
Yes, so what you've said is exactly what where we were going as a task force. Yeah.
Okay, so with that clarification, can I go back to Lynn and Renee?
So I sort of toyed with putting my hand down because I didn't want to repeat what I've said before, but I guess the conversation is sort of helpful and not helpful in some respects, because are we saying then if I've got human intervention, it's not a natural resource? And then are we then saying that chapter 5 on living resources is a chapter that's not about natural resources then? Or it is about natural resources? Because, and I just still find it confusing, and maybe we just need to leave it to the task force to take away all these comments and deal with them. But I also had a similar observation to Mary around human intervention to exploit and drive financial capacity that then drives you into a different set of accounting guidelines, guidance, and a different type of asset I can understand as well. So I don't know if that divide helps in the thinking as well. But I guess there's a lot in this discussion for the task force to perhaps take away. But at the moment, it's still not clear to me.
Yeah, so I think this is about signposting actually, because I think what you've described there, Lynn, is entirely right, that actually where you have a living resource that has been subject to intervention, then that places it in another standard, and that is likely to be agriculture, for example, even if the fit is not exactly at the moment. And then you get into the questions that Mari has raised about how do you value it and all of that kind of thing. But it's the dividing line is what pushes you into something else. Another area of guidance. And that's what staff have tried to get over, but clearly the signposting isn't working at the moment. So therefore, that's what needs to be attended to. Renee, final word, and I'm going to move us on because I think we've been around this. I think there's clearly some clarity and some signposting that's required.
Thank you. So I raised my hand again because you asked whether we're comfortable with this approach to signposting. So what I will leave with the board and the staff is this reflection that by not calling something a natural resource, when in reality, people will still perceive it as a natural resource because there may have been human intervention, but it's not the type of human intervention that turns it into an asset. I find that it's creating it's disconnected from the reality of what people expect a natural resource is described as. So my question back to staff is, why do we signpost biological item based on human interventions? Human interventions can leave you in a natural resource space or in the non-financial statement space, therefore the GPFR space. If the intervention is such that you're not creating an asset. So that's why human intervention is a critical factor to the whole analysis. But it's its placement in the logic and in the signposting. I'm still struggling with its placement being at the very top of and disqualifying a natural resource from being a natural resource. It's definitely a factor to consider for control and whether we have an asset, but it's very possible that that intervention will not get you into a standard. We will be left in the GPFR space where we will have a natural resource and now an item, we call it an item, to be dealt with in the future stage of our board's journey, right, on sustainability reporting. So it's I still struggle like Lynn with the signposting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Edwin, do you want to say anything final on that? I think we understand your point again, Renee, which is what happens to something where there has been human intervention but would not qualify for recognition in the financial statements.
Yeah, so I guess at this point, I'll definitely have to go back to the task force and figure out how to make that signposting much more clear. I think one important thing to raise is that like I keep hearing that human intervention is tied to control, but that's not really necessarily the case. And like that, our intention was to have the two separated. So I think it's kind of related to the issue that I'll bring up soon. But when we figure out this logic flow, I'm going to have to factor that into delineating between control and human intervention as well.
Okay, thanks for that. So I think, you know, it's been useful in elucidating, and I think we've got clarity now on the area that Renee has raised concerns about. I think we do have to be clearer about the signposting and where we set out the logic flow. I think Murray and Mark have both raised questions about whether we've got the drafting exactly right that describes human intervention in the first place. And I think what we need to do is, now we've got the 3 chapters on subsoil, water and living resources, we need to keep testing the wording and think, does it actually work? Does it actually address issues particularly like conservation expenditure, and reflect on that. You know, so I think that's clear instruction on this. Now let's go back into living resources, and in introducing it as another tricky area, I think this is one of the most difficult areas in the paper. So let's go back into your slide, Edwin.
Okay, so the next change we've made is to revisit conservation or preservation activities. And that is described in paragraphs 5, 16, and 18. And essentially, so what we did was we looked to national standard setters and what they've done. And really the only example we've found is explicit example was in South Africa. And essentially what they said is you have to look at the nature of the activities performed, and that could either become inventory, PP&E, or in some cases an intangible asset. So we've kind of followed the same approach here and said that's how we would account for preservation activities. Now, hearing all the questions we've had in the earlier discussion, we did not actually say how you would account for the underlying asset. And I think that's definitely one of the points we'll have to add into the CP. So I'll go back to the task force on that. And offhand, my immediate reaction is that it could be some sort of PP&E, because really when you're conserving an asset or a living resource anyway, it's very similar to a bearer plant where you're really holding it to produce essentially other bearer plants or other resources, and you're not holding it for sale. So I think that might be a possibility, but again, I'll have to run that by the task force first before I present it as a formal finding. So I'll stop it there and get reactions from the board.
Okay, it does. The discussion we're having does suggest to me that whilst you can't be categoric, it might be helpful after the discussion actually possibly to have a table just with you know, some examples of the types of you know, because you give references to the standards, but it might be better to be a bit more explicit and say clearly it depends on the facts and the circumstance, but these sorts of things might be this. And I think also, you know, there are some, certainly I'd had concerns expressed to me as to how does this interact with, you know, human intervention. And so I think we probably could be a bit more explicit. Renee, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think, Chair, you're going where I was going. When I read that part of the paper, I was expecting that the discussion would not just be around how to account for the activities themselves, but how the activities of preservation have an impact on assessing the underlying natural resource as being human intervention. It's a type of human intervention. So I think if we agree that in further articulating what we mean by human intervention, we will eventually get into a discussion of the different types and their impact on the assessment of the asset definition, then I'm good with that. But this is not what the paper didn't go as far as taking it on the angle of the impact on the underlying resource. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. David.
Thank you, Ian. So picking up on a point that Renee's just made, and also a point that Lynn made earlier, I think we need to remember what this chapter is supposed to be talking about. And that is living resources that actually don't fall into the scope of anything else. I think based on what's just been talked about, and in some of what's already in this chapter, that we're in danger, and I think Lynn's actually has been confused by it, we're in danger of talking too much about what we might want to do in terms of, say, IPSAS 27. And now if you want to start adding in about, well, how do you account for conservation and preservation activities? That's not what this chapter is supposed to be about. So I just want to issue a warning that we need staff and the task force need to consider, what are we trying to get constituents' views on? Signposting to say that we might need to give extra guidance on conservation or preservation in another standard's fine, but that's not what the chapter's about. So a warning.
Thanks, David. And I think back to Renee's point that actually, if that's saying, look, this doesn't, it's about clarifying how does this relate to that whole question about what actually is a natural resource, does it impact on it or not? And the answer is probably not, but we just need to make sure it's located firmly in that decision. But I think it's also then, go and have a look at IPSAS 17, or you're back in the agriculture standard, but that's enough. It's not, because then you distract from, as you say, the logic flow and the arguments in terms of what remains as a natural resource, a living resource that we need to account for in these proposals. Okay. Okay, so take us back to the slide then, Edwin.
Okay, so the next point is clarification between human intervention and control, which we've kind of touched on already, and that's in paragraphs 5.35 to 5.38. And just at a very high level, control is really just the ability to use the resource for economic benefit or service potential, or to direct the use of the resource. So that definition in itself doesn't really have anything to do with changing the quantity or quality of the resource, which is what human intervention is. So there are cases where the two concepts will overlap. So for example, if I go out and harvest a bunch of trees, then obviously that's human intervention and you're gaining control. But just to clarify, you're gaining control now of lumber, which is no longer a natural resource. So that would be a case where it's both control and human intervention. But it is possible for you to have some sort of control mechanism, like setting up a fence around a forest. But if you're letting the forest grow on its own, then that's not human intervention. So we try to articulate that in the CP to clarify that these two concepts, while they could be related, they don't necessarily have to be related, and they are separate.
Okay, I mean, I think we've had a number of comments from members to the effect that we haven't got there yet on that. And that does go back into the signposting and making the logic flow clearer. Are there any other comments anybody wants to make to the discussions and the points that have already been made by members? Okay, so I think we've got the instructions out on that one. So back to the slide, Edwin.
Okay, the last point that I wanted to raise is really other changes to a chapter. And I guess the first one relates to what David just raised. So originally the discussion on related activities was in the appendices, and we've moved that into the chapter. But I guess I'll be careful in the next version to make sure that we don't go too much into the related activities, and it should really just be signposting to the various IPSAS that could be applicable. The other major change, which is substantive, is that in the original version or the prior version of the chapter, we essentially concluded for measurement that in some cases, you could have a situation where it's not possible to measure a living resource, and we kind of just left it at that. So now we've kind of looked at that PV and clarified that it really depends on the reasons why you're holding a living resource. If you're holding it for financial capacity, then you very well could or easily get a sort of appropriate measurement basis for recognition. Whereas if you're holding it for operational capacity, that we were trying to think of ways that you could come up with a measurement difference, but for resources that you're holding for things like biodiversity, it's really extremely difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a way to measure it. So that's why we've refined the PV now to separate the two capacities. We said if you're holding a living resource that meets the asset recognition or meets the asset definition, and you're holding it for financial capacity, then it's possible to recognize it as an asset. Whereas if you're holding a living resource that meets the asset definition for operational capacity, it may not be possible for you to have an appropriate basis for measurement, and therefore it would not be recognized as an asset.
Thanks, Edwin. So can I just take comments from members on whether they're content with that distinction? Kamira and then Todd.
Thanks, Chair. I'm concerned about this preliminary view number 8. I would rather try to focus on operational capacity and not in financial capacity, because as it was mentioned before, most probably if there is an asset that is held for financial capacity, it will not be in the scope of this standard. So then just let's focus on operational capacity. And then the tone of the preliminary view is already like, okay, if you have a living resource that is for operational capacity, you are not able to measure it reliably. So it's very negative. And I think there are ways in which even if it's for operational capacity, there is an active market for those living resources. If we're talking about animals, or so, let's don't be so negative on the measurement for operational capacity. So thanks.
Thanks, Kamira. Todd.
I had a similar point, I think, to Kamira, in that I was really struggling when I read these paragraphs to even sort of conceptualize what a living resource with financial capacity looks like. Is there such a thing, given that we're talking about, you know, a natural resource here, a living resource in its natural state? So, yeah, it's very supportive, I think, of Kamira's view from that perspective, you know, in terms of whether that even makes sense. And perhaps open to thinking about whether we can measure living resources that are going to be held for operational capacity.
Thanks, Todd. Yes, I must admit, on a personal basis, when I read that, I thought, well, I suppose I can see a circumstance where you might have something that was a natural resource that you were kind of basically about to sell in its current state, and therefore there might be a sort of argument for a kind of you know, ED 79 style approach, because you cleared, but otherwise, and I think, you know, there is a clear instruction then based on what Kamira has said, that we need to get that sense over as to what the focus is, and that this is, you know, the financial capacity is an exceptional circumstance rather than the norm. So if I can take comments then from, sorry, Kamira, did you want to come back on that, or? No, okay. So I've got Lynn, then Mari, then Renee.
So I had a few observations here. So we suddenly introduced this financial capacity, operating capacity in this chapter. And I guess my first observation, if it's good enough, if it's good for this chapter, why not other chapters? Why do we suddenly come here on living resources. We haven't gone there on water. We haven't gone there on subsoil. If it's useful, we ought to do that analysis consistently across the chapters and the different types of natural resource. It was interesting that Kamira's view is it's out of scope, or isn't it out of scope, or is it a signposting issue to other standards, which again links us back to, are we clear in our signposting if we are saying go somewhere else for guidance? I guess that leaves me to my sort of final point, which is an overarching one, but it is related, which is, what are our constituents expecting to see from this project? And actually, we seem to be taking a definition and narrowing it down to then end up with things that we are unlikely to recognise. I think our constituents probably wanted to understand the entirety of how I account for any type of natural resource in the layman's definition of natural resource. Now, maybe that is about signposting, but we have to be careful that we don't go so narrow here that we only end up addressing one element. So I do think there is a narrative that needs to run through that isn't quite there at the moment in the CP, that says, you know, a layman's definition of natural resource is this, and this is exactly how I deal with different elements of that. So not take too much out of scope, or if we're signposting, actually across that suite of layman definition, here's where you find the guidance across all of that, rather than just saying, actually, I've now chosen to define it in such a narrow way that actually I'm not going to end up doing anything other than a bit of disclosure.
I think we understand your concerns, Lynn. I think what we have to do, though, is our constituents have actually asked us, how do we account for this? How do we break it down? And what we're trying to do is put a financial reporting lens on it and say, this is how we would address it using the conceptual framework, using the tools that we already have, and these are the additional tools. So I think in terms of let's not take a step so far back that we lose the thinking that we've actually done. If people feel we're taking too narrow a view, they can tell us that. But I think what we have to do is actually get the signposting right in terms of, this is how we as financial reporting experts are proposing to analyse this. And it is proposals at the moment, you know, and it's like a lot of other things. Actually, a layman might have all kinds of thoughts, but actually, how would an accountant address this? And that's what we're trying to do, is to put those frameworks and so on onto it. So I think let's look at this as a signposting challenge, not a we need to rethink all of this at this stage. So, you know, I think there is what we really need to do, and this is why we've added an additional meeting, is actually we need to get through the debates, we need to land the accountant debates, and then we can actually stand back and say, how does this actually work, you know, in terms of what we need to say about the much broader debate about sustainability reporting and things like that. So I think that's, you know, that's the point in time when we should actually say, okay, how does this fit from a communications point of view? So if I can go then to Mari, Renee, and Lucy, and then Thomas.
Thank you. I understand the discussion, and so from my point of view, I agree with Camilla and Todd, and so I pay attention to the sentence that described in the chapter 1.2 B, the last sentence. The information about resources should inform policy decisions, and policy decisions is so interesting words, and so maybe the operational capacity is such a important information from my point of view, and so it is supplemented in the presentation by some kind of non-financial information also, and so it is my concern. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, just responding to Lynn's point about that issue sort of suddenly popping up in living resources. I think perhaps the instruction to staff on this is, can you have a look at this issue? I mean, Mari's raised a cross-reference in chapter 1. Could you also have a look at it in section 2, which is where a lot of the accounting principles, chapter 2, where a lot of the accounting principles are actually discussed? Because it may be that actually a generic reference, which then gets you into actually what are really measurement, what measurement basis would you select? Actually, that's maybe more relevant in most cases. Okay, so if we can have that as an instruction. So I go to Renee and then Lucy and then Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I want to build on the comments made so far, reactions to the PV. I too reacted to it as finding it very quick to conclude that a natural resource with operational capacity, would not meet the criteria for recognizing it as an asset. It's true that it may not most of the time meet the criteria, but I find that we concluded too quick, too categorical. I liked the discussion in paragraph 553 and 554. I found that the discussion there was opening the possibility to it. If an entity is able to, then it could. And also, it also referred to the fact that scientific knowledge and experience in developing measurement techniques for these very unusual assets, it's still at a very early stage. There will be a lot of development, and I think very fast in the near future. And I would want us to recognize that we may not know today how to measure, but we may know tomorrow how to measure. And right now, the PV seems to conclude too fast. I would want it to be more an open one. And maybe we could add an SMC here to this PV, asking constituents their view on how measurement, what measurement techniques or what do they know in that space right now that would be helpful to the board in providing maybe future guidance on the difficulty of measuring. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I mean, I saw nods and thumbs up from members to that. And that certainly seems sensible to go in that direction. Edwin, any sort of observations then on that?
I think that's a good idea. So we'll definitely go back to the task force and I wouldn't say I would say we should be less categorical and really just leave it a bit open. Yeah, so I can definitely do that.
Thanks. So I think that was certainly what I was sensing from reactions from members, that I could see that we needed to set it in the way that Renee was describing there. And it may well be that SMC approach on that would actually be helpful. Clearly we've got to be mindful about interactions and anything that, might be said in measurement and so on, but in terms of timing and so on, of moving to an exposure draft, that seems very sensible to go that route. Thanks for that, Renee. So then I go to Lucy and then to Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm just relating paragraph 6.10b on financial information in chapter 6 and preliminary view number 10b regarding depreciation or impairment. And it would seem that in the present draft, there is less discussion regarding depreciation or impairments in chapter 5. So I'm just thinking of a case of impairment on living resources, and I'm thinking if in the case of trees in virgin forests that got burned, could this be an example of impairment that we can include in chapter 5? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so Edwin, I think if you can take that issue away, again, it comes back into that would only be applicable to items that have been recognised, at least in terms of a financial impact. So again, we need to think of it in that way, but you're right, Lucy, we do need to pick those issues up, and where the guidance, we would see the guidance sitting. For example, can we use our existing guidance on impairment and so on? Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And sorry for jumping a little bit back, but kind of speaking last, I think that's what could happen. Just to support to some extent the concerns Lynn was just raising, I think that has been reflected in the CAC discussion about the description of natural resources, including living resources, which we had in June as well, where CAC members kind of struggled to understand really what it is, and therefore said probably the overarching question which has an influence on the description of either both natural resources and living resources, and what it exactly is the question, why are we requesting this information for stewardship purposes or for other purposes, and what is the usefulness of the information presented in financial statements? I think probably there's not enough clarity yet what the exact purpose is, and probably I think that could be described a little bit more crisp in paragraph or in chapter 1 in the project aims. I think there's already some good material where it's saying, okay, the purpose is not kind of maintaining long-term sustainability or preservation of intergenerational equity. The focus is on the accounting of natural resources, but the why do we think accounting of natural resources is important? I think that was what the CAG was recommending to clarify.
Thanks, Thomas. So I would counsel, though, we have already trampled over chapter 1 multiple times. And what has happened each time we do that is it gets longer, which doesn't help with the clarity. So I think your comment there, Thomas, is around crispness. And I think that probably applies all the way through, that thinking needs to be clear, which doesn't necessarily equate to more length. I think it's about the overall thought process being clarified, which is clearly the tenor of the comments that we've had from members. But I would counsel that does not necessarily mean more words. It means better choice and clearer use of words, and perhaps diagrams. And it may be diagrams rather than flowcharts would help here, because I think if I go back to Renee's comments, for example, it's actually, she can see a flow in a flowchart, but what happens to the stuff that gets kicked out along the way? You know, and that's, I think, is that map, and getting that map over, which is actually really giving people problems here, you know, and then, you know, so I think there's plenty of material in chapter 1. It's just maybe that it needs crispness rather than length.
Agree 100%.
Renee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I really like what you just described as an approach, and I think it will help with our credibility as a board, and that we start from the wider, bigger perspective and we narrow it down. But the logic is outlined, and through that logic, while we end up in a very narrow space at the end, we've acknowledged that we started very large, and we acknowledge that this is a very early, a space that's in its infancy, and eventually we want to play a role, and then we'll probably go and play a role in that bigger space. But to acknowledge it, I think, to me, will help with our credibility as a board.
Thanks, Renee. And I think, you know, although members have talked about going narrow, actually really what we're talking about is actually the things that need to be dealt with in other standards. So in a sense, this becomes a sort of residual standard with a lot of other things dealt with in agriculture, in PP&E, you know, inventories and so on. So it's actually giving people that sense that, look, there's already guidance on this. It's just you need to go there rather than here, which is actually the residual. You know, and I think we still haven't communicated that. So I think if we can get that kind of, you know, more mapping rather than flowcharts, that would certainly help. And it seems that that's really what we've actually got to get straight. And I think as ever, when you try and do something like that, it does actually help in terms of clarifying the thinking and addressing the very real concerns which members are expressing at this stage about how we communicate and have we all got a shared clarity in the thought process. Okay, so I think we've got the general comments out on the chapter. I think with all of that general stuff out, I still think it might be worth just walking through page by page and just pick up any specific comments that anybody has, because we haven't actually done that. And I think that would still, you know, if there are any remaining comments, that would just help staff in you know, bringing back the chapter. So I think if we can just literally walk through page by page, and again, just pick up incremental comments from members. So if I can get any comments on the page 46, which is 5.1 through 5.3. Okay, so then move on to page 47, which is through to paragraph 5.7. So then we're on to the third page, which is 5.8 through to 5.9, and Edwin has taken away the action, which is that we'll come back with an alternative to the flowchart. Okay, so we're now on page 49 of the document, which is paragraphs 5.10 through to 5.18. Yeah, David.
Thank you, Chair. I'm finding it a bit confusing following your page references because they're totally different to mine. But there we go. However, 5.10 through to 5.15 seem to be talking a lot about IPSAS 27. And so this sort of, I think, goes back to the point I raised earlier. Is there too much on what IPSAS 27 is saying? And should we make it more of a signpost rather than some substantive text?
Okay, so if you can take that away, Edwin, as an instruction. Okay, so Lucy.
No, this could be editorial, but I just noticed that in 5.14 and 15, we use plant, property, and equipment. I think it should be the other way. Property, plant, and equipment.
Thanks, Lucy. Fair comment.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think we're now on 5.19 through to 5.26. Leslie, are you still in? Oh, no, Renee, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I don't know. I had something on 5.17, so sorry if I missed that.
No,
so in
go ahead.
5.17, I was just wondering, we refer to assets, inventory, PP&E, intangibles. And I'm wondering, can we expand this to also include potential expense treatment, right? Because again, it may not lead to an asset, it could be an expense. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah, okay, noted. So anything else on 5.19 through 5.26? Then we're on to 5.27 through 5.32. And then 5.33 through 5.36. And obviously there are certainly some there'll be some impacts of the discussions we've had about control versus intervention, for example, and so on. David.
Thank you, Ian. I just wanted to raise the use of the word sessile, which actually has two different meanings, one in botany and one in biology, and they actually are quite different. So I understand what Edwin was trying to do there, but actually it would be safer to use non-motile instead of sessile.
Okay. I must admit, I'd never met the term before, either in botany or wherever else it was. So, but then so yeah, let's just use non-motile. Renee.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have to apologize. I'm slow, so I'm back to the parts of the guidance that deals with biological item. I think that based on our discussion this morning, I would want to see some redrafting. So for example, in reframing biological items. So for example, we start at 521 by saying that a biological item is meant to provide contrast with biological asset. To me, I wouldn't be at the asset level yet. I would bring biological item higher up to recognize the fact that from a natural resource, we get to a biological item. And then from a biological item, we may end up into an asset or not and stay at that level. So to me, that would change the reframing of that section. Thank you.
Okay, so if we instruct staff to review that in the context of clarifying the overall flow in the document, and then that would address your point. Okay, so I think we were, I was just picking up points on 527 through 532. And then 533 through 536. 537 through 543. And then, David.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It was in paragraph 539D, and I'm struggling to work out how control can be indicated by a living resource being able to give birth naturally.
Thanks, David. I think it's the way it's expressed, isn't it? That's the problem. Edwin?
Yeah, I think the intention there was living resources that are already controlled, giving birth. So the offspring of something that's already controlled would most likely be controlled as well. So I can definitely work with the wording on that.
Right, okay, thank you. Then we're on 544 through to 548. And then 550 through to 554. David.
Thank you, Ian. I wondered whether the paragraphs on measurement were actually in the right place, because the paragraph 549, we've reached a conclusion. And it seems to me that when you start to read the paragraphs on measurement, they're applicable to the decision, the conclusion you've reached. So I just wonder if they're in the right place.
Thanks, David. So, Edwin, if we can instruct you to have a look at the flow there, and particularly if we actually have, and the positioning of PVs in that flow, the PVs don't have to wait until the end, they can appear at the end of a logical section. So if you can revisit that, that would be helpful, and that may mean repositioning the text as well. Lynn, go ahead.
So my comment, and we have touched on this a little bit before, but in 554, we sort of start off saying measurement might involve a lot of judgment, and then we then say, but then you can't measure it. And then the PV talks about and the PV is not very consistent because it talks about it may not be feasible and then seems to come down with a rule that you can't measure. So I think in looking at all of that, you need to really look at 554 because it's not really leading us to the PV, and we need some consistency and better link there.
Thanks, Lynn. Yep, okay. So I think we'll skip over the PV at the moment because we need to see the redraft of this section. We're on, and then I think 556, 555 through 557, obviously that will change in terms of Lindy's suggestion about using a disclosure objective approach or considering doing that. Okay, so Edwin, that's given quite a lot to go at there, but I think this is one of the really, this is where the difficulty, you know, is probably at its greatest. Therefore, it's flushed out all of those comments from members and those concerns. Anything else that you want out of the session in terms of living resources?
No, but I see Mari has her hand up. So
yeah, okay, fine, Mari.
I'm so sorry. About the 547, the word uncultivated forest. It is difficult to uncultivated forest because the to biodiversity or the so that in order to protect the forest, there is the government conduct activities about this to thin the forest, and so the uncultivated forest is a contradict to the definition of the human intervention and control, and so it's my concern. So thank you so much, and so sorry.
No problem, Mari. So I think, Edwin, if you can have another look at that 547, because clearly getting the concept right in terms of forests is going to be, you know, of concern to many governments. So, you know, I think it's back to situating it in that overall logic flow, and then the comments made by Renee and supported by Lynn, I think will come in terms of how we approach measurement and so on. So that's relevant to that. Okay, so we have quarter of an hour remaining. I'm wondering whether we start water or whether we actually leave water till tomorrow. Ross, do you want to just come in terms of some administrative comments?
Sure, Ian. So obviously we're ahead of the agenda today. So we will be starting accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans tomorrow with the additional time. I don't think what we've got left on natural resources is going to fill up all the time until the social event tomorrow. So I think we'll definitely get a start on accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans. We might even get into a quick update on my program and technical director's report, again, depending on how far we get on the accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans item and the time that'll take us to go through the final issue on natural resources. And I think we're not necessarily not okay with that, because I think we wanted extra time anyway on Tuesday to discuss in the private session the sustainability items. We started discussions on Monday, so we will use that extra time if we have it for the board in camera session on Tuesday. The question will be at the end of tomorrow on whether we've closed the open part of the meeting by the end of tomorrow or not, and whether we need the entire board, TAs and observers to attend next Tuesday. So just flagging that for members, TAs, observers to understand as we are finding ourselves a little bit ahead of schedule which is a nice change. We've been behind a lot in these virtual meetings, and we've made a lot of progress. So thanks to members for the good engagement so far and the helpful interventions, in particular on natural resources today. I think it's been a good discussion. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So I think with members' forbearance, I think what we'll do is we'll do 15 minutes to get started on the water item, and then we'll break after 15 minutes, and then we'll carry on discussions tomorrow morning. So over to staff just to introduce the redrafted chapter on water.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Thank you. So firstly, I would like to provide an overview of Chapter 4 on water. The water chapter covers the description of water in its natural state. It considers whether water in its natural state meets the definition of an asset, and if it is measurable, and proposes that water impounded in dams and canals that meets the definition of an asset because it is controlled but not measurable should be disclosed, and recommends non-disclosure of water in its natural state, such as rivers, seas, natural lakes, because water from these sources does not meet the definition of an asset as it moves naturally and freely. The changes that we're going to be talking about reflect the IPSASB's instructions that we received from the June 2021 meeting. Firstly, we'll consider the changes made to the description. The task force departed from the scientific description of water proposed at the June meeting, that water is a chemical compound, formula H2O, because the description was not helpful and not clear, and it also was an old, based on an old definition which predates the 19th century. So a simplified plain language description of water has been provided in paragraph 4.1 of the draft consultation paper as follows. Water comprise surface water in seas, rivers, streams, lakes, groundwater aquifers, and water impounded in dams and canals. The previous description only emphasized water in seas, rivers, streams, and lakes. The task force also added groundwater aquifers and water in dams and canals to the description of water because they are also important resources in the context of water. I think, Chair, I'll stop there and would like to just ask if the IPSASB agree with the recommendation for the simplified description of water.
Thanks, Emma.
Not sure.
Great, okay. So thanks for that. Ajith.
Thanks. Thanks, yeah. I just on the description of water, I just thought I'll mention that the description relating to water in dams is not quite appropriate because water is actually in a reservoir, not in a dam. Dam is only used to block the flow of the water, and the water is actually then contained in a reservoir where most of the contours of the reservoir is hills on the two sides, mountains on the two sides. And therefore, water in a dam may not be the appropriate description. I think water in a reservoir is what would be the appropriate description, because dam is only a very small component of the containment. And most of the containment is actually the two sides, which contains hills and mountains, which that will be the reservoir. So water in a reservoir is probably a more appropriate definition to use. Thank you.
So Ajith, rather than try and, wordsmith this, could we just actually say includes rather than comprises? Because, there's a whole heap of, there's a huge range of things, but I think it's intended just to give us a sense at this stage of what we're talking about without predicating the discussion coming later.
But I mean, I'm not predicating the discussion coming later, but I'm referring to the definition of the water itself, because the water is actually not in a dam, water is in a reservoir. That dam is only...
Right, okay, yeah, I get your point. Yeah, okay, all right, yeah, come on. Yeah, okay, so
thank you.
Just make that change, yeah. Okay, so Edwin, with that refinement to the wording, if you can, sorry, not Edwin, Amon, you can take us back into the slide.
Okay. We'll change that and I'll take it back to the slide. All right, so the task force also clarified when water is in its natural state and when water is processed in paragraphs 4.2 to 4.6 of the draft CP. Please note that the draft CP currently states that water is extracted when it's not in its natural state. However, member comments, I've just been notified that this is a wrong view from the slide.
We can still see the text, Amon,
okay.
So carry on.
Okay, problem. Please note that before we had indicated that when water is not in its natural state, it's extracted. However, member comments after posting the agenda papers advise that we maybe use the term processed rather than extracted in the context of water that is not in its natural state. The previous draft CP was also not clear whether water in human-made structures such as dams, canals, artificial lakes, reservoirs, and straighted river channels was in its natural state in the scope of the CP, and when water was not in this natural state. So we also tried to clarify that. So the task force clarified that water is in its natural state when it forms part of a natural water cycle, which flows in a continuous loop within Earth and atmosphere. Water evaporates into the atmosphere, cools and condenses, and falls back to Earth as rain and snow, which accumulates in lakes, rivers, and underground. By this clarification, the task force did three things. It moved away from the explanation or description that water in its natural state is free-flowing, because it could be argued that dams may restrict the flow of water downstream. So even though there is human intervention because of human-made structures that are erected when water is impounded in dams and canals, we clarify that when water is in human-made structures, it is also in its natural state as it forms part of the water cycle, as you see. So water impounded in dams and water naturally occurring is in its natural state. And that when water is drawn from underground, when water is treated and purified and filtered, and when water is in wastewater treatment, this is when it's processed and is no longer in the scope of this draft CP. So I'll also pose this question to the task force, if they agree what we mean by when water is in its natural state and when water is processed.
Thanks, Simon. So open up for comments on those changes. Renee and then Lucy.
So I like the thinking here. I find that we're more advanced in articulating the human intervention implications here on water than we are on living resources. And again, it's degree and nature of human intervention. So not all human intervention lead to an asset, but some do. And it would, again, maybe an opportunity to consider to start broader. That, you know, human interventions in general, they're a fact and they will occur at different degree. It's only a subset of those interventions that get you to the conclusion on the slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. That does refer back into that discussion in paragraph 118, I think, and then testing it in each of those those circumstances, doesn't it? Okay, so then I've got Lucy, then David, then Adrian.
Yes, thank you, Chair. On the assumption that water in dams and canals, water in artificial lakes, and water in the state and river banks is still in natural state because the human action neither stops nor changes the water cycle. What if this water got contaminated due to oil spill? Is the contamination considered as human intervention that changes the quality of the water? And in this case, is the water no longer considered in its natural state and therefore no longer under the scope of this standard? Then can we consider now the contamination may fall under the concept of impairment? So I suggest that we have to have some specific guidelines included in this chapter in case water changes from its natural state. Now, in the case of the contaminated water, if the contaminated water is treated to restore in its original state, will it then be considered as back in its natural state? So these are the questions that I would like I would like to be clarified on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So if staff can take that away and address the issues around contamination. David, or at least in financial reporting terms, let's qualify that, not around contamination more broadly. David.
Thank you. I find that table that Amon presented in the slide very helpful, and I'm wondering whether it would also be helpful for constituents and whether it should be included in the CP.
Thanks, David, and certainly I know diagrams help for many individuals. So yeah, if we can ask staff to include that. Adrian.
Thank you, Jan. Just a very, very small question. Well, we don't have Russian or Norwegian colleagues, but we have Canadian colleagues who might have an answer to my question. That is, with regards to the definition of natural water, what about icebergs? What about the ice pack? Which, well, it's not only joking on that. It's also because the ice pack is something that has quite a substantial importance in some coastal countries. So, for instance, what would Renee think of that?
I think it's a good comment. I think we should reflect in how to bring it in. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think that's probably the point at which we should pause as we're on the hour. So I think if we break at that point for today, and then we will come back into the review of the chapter on water tomorrow, based on that understanding that we've achieved at that stage. So I think with that, we break at the end of today's session. Thanks everyone for very good interventions. I think we've covered a lot of ground. And as Ross has said, if you can be prepared to also look at the retirement benefit plans item during tomorrow's session, that would be helpful. Ross, anything else to say from you?
Nothing else from me, Ian, thanks.
Okay, great. So have a good break, everyone, and see you back tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.